But essentially, what Bitcoin is basically a technological invention that can make basically it solves digital scarcity, right? So it's like a digital asset that can't be copied, and it's a bare asset, much like gold or much like physical cash. And so we've seen over time that ever since it was created, ever since it became liquid enough to have kind of a measurable price, it's had this rather exponential market share and value. And so what this chart shows is the Bitcoin price in log form. And we see that there are generally a few different cycles. And so far, they've correlated. It could be caused, it could be correlated with the pre-programmed supply flow halvings. And so Bitcoin is programmed every 4 years to reduce the issuance of new Bitcoins generated every 10 minutes by half. And so what that generally does is that causes, supply goes down, or at least new supply goes down, while demand is kind of at a steady state. And so you start to get the next bull run. And so those bull runs, however, also kind of correlated with overall risk on market behavior. And so what we've generally seen is that Bitcoin has had numerous quote unquote bubbles along the way. It's also fallen over 80% multiple times. It's pronounced dead. It consolidates and then it kind of ramps up again. And so far, it was created in early 2009. And so we have over 12 years of it functioning well, it gaining market share. And the way I've described this is that we're essentially seeing Bitcoin being monetized in real time. And so we don't know how this trend is going to end, right? This could eventually roll over and fall off. But so far, we have 12 years of history, essentially going from zero up to at one point was over $1 trillion in market cap. Now is in the upper several hundred billions. And so we're seeing this long process play out of it becoming, an asset class in its own right. And of course, a number of other cryptocurrencies were launched in its wake to try to do different tasks. Many of them unsuccessful, but a handful of them have been successful as well. Now, as someone, I'm arguing the pro Bitcoin position here, but I'm actually, I've been a gold investor for many years, so I actually like both Bitcoin and gold. And my overall viewpoint is that essentially they have different pros and cons, and that Bitcoin brings a lot that's new to the table. And so this chart is from Vijay Boyapati. He's a former Google engineer. He was a big he got into Austrian economics. He was a proponent of Ron Paul and helped him organize grassroots organization. But anyway, he put a table up showing Bitcoin versus gold versus fiat currencies and their various pros and cons. And I'll focus on the Bitcoin and gold side. And so gold has certain advantages in the sense that it's more durable, right? So if I had to say, what is the asset that I'm sure won't be worth $0, 100 years from now, it'd be gold. It doesn't require any energy input to maintain itself. And then it's also somewhat more fungible. And then it also, of course, has the longest established history of virtually any asset. Now, what Bitcoin brings to the table is a couple different variables where it's actually stronger. And so it's far more portable. In fact, gold's lack of portability was part of why it got centralized in the first place. So banks would issue banknotes that are, tied to gold rather than people carrying around the gold themselves. That's what made it more divisible, and that's what made it more portable. The neat thing about Bitcoin is that it's a digitally native bear asset. So in this world, it's increasingly focused on e-commerce, long distance payments, and things like that. The fact that Bitcoin is digitally native is very important. So you can transact with someone trustlessly using Bitcoin over the internet, whereas you cannot do that with gold. If you were to try to use gold for that purpose, you'd have to rely on centralized third parties, either to store the gold or to convert it to fiat on the way, whereas Bitcoin is actually a digital native bearer asset. And same wise, for example, if someone were fleeing a jurisdiction, right, and going to another jurisdiction across international borders or through an airport, good luck bringing, 5 figures or more of gold with you. Whereas Bitcoin can be brought through on a smartphone, it can be brought through by remembering 12-word seed phrase in your head, and so it's a very challenging asset to be stopped or confiscated in many ways. It's also more verifiable, right? So, gold coins are generally pretty easy to verify, but verifying a gold bar, to be sure, you pretty much have to melt it down and check the whole thing. Whereas Bitcoin is programmed to be easily verifiable. So any full node can check on the whole blockchain to see if certain Bitcoin are indeed genuine. In addition, it's also auditable. So if I wanted to prove to someone that I own a certain amount of Bitcoin, maybe to get a loan or something like that, to prove that I have assets to correspond with that, I can easily digitally sign and show, with proof on the blockchain that I control a certain amount of Bitcoin, whereas auditing large pools of gold is obviously much more difficult and more prone to trust. Bitcoin's also more divisible, right? So it can be broken down into 8 decimal places. That could even be changed in the future if need be. That you can divide it further, and that of course doesn't mean that you inflate it. That means that basically, kind of like how you can break an ounce of gold into grams of gold, right? You can or atoms of gold even, but of course it's not economically feasible. Bitcoin is just divisible. Each one is divisible into very, very small components that have a variety of use cases, especially on the Lightning Network, which I'll get to a little bit later. And then lastly, in terms of scarcity, and so gold still does have an inflation rate, which makes sense as it's mined. We have a generally a small inflation rate of maybe 1.5 to 2%, sometimes a little higher per year. Whereas Bitcoin, the inflation rate goes down every year. It's pre-programmed to do this, and so basically, as we got to this point, now Bitcoin actually has a lower inflation rate than gold, and it's only going to go down from here. So whenever we have halvings, that's going to keep happening. And then one final point is also more censorship resistant, right? So it's actually harder to confiscate Bitcoin or to block Bitcoin-based payments than it is to do so with gold. And so a classic history of gold was that it was often confiscated in history. It was often stored in centralized areas that were then, taken over. Whereas Bitcoin is actually, for people that know how to handle it properly, is actually very, very hard to confiscate. And so you see things like, for example, the Russian opposition leader, his bank accounts are often shut down, but international supporters or domestic supporters can still sometimes send him Bitcoin because that's actually very, very hard for say, systems of power to block, right? And so it's actually, showing a degree of resiliency that is hard to mimic with other assets. Another thing I like about Bitcoin that I think is worth pointing out is that, over time, Bitcoin keeps getting stronger, right? So when you own Bitcoin, there are thousands of people working constantly to make it more useful. And so what this chart is the amount of Bitcoin capacity that's on the Lightning layer. So that's Bitcoin's layer 2. That focuses on the more instantaneous small transactions that the base layer is less suitable for. And so what this shows is that, Lightning came later than Bitcoin, right? So it was conceived in 2015. It was pretty much launched in late 2017. And initially, there was a lot of liquidity added to it. So a lot of Bitcoins were added to it by people trying to bootstrap the network. It wasn't very efficiently allocated, right? So it took about a year for that to kind of consolidate and sort out into more useful place. But then over time, developers continued to add functionality to it. They made marketplaces to manage channels, right? So for people that aren't familiar, Bitcoin's base layer is a broadcast network, whereas Lightning is a channel-based network. And so its limitation, whereas Bitcoin's base layer has a limitation of how much transactions it can do. Lightning has no constraint like that, but it is constrained by liquidity. So the more channels that exist, the easier it is to send payments around the network in this like spider web of payment infrastructure. And so over time, it's gradually grown as it's developed. And this is only a 2 or 3 year period. But what we've seen recently is that it's just hit critical mass, meaning that there's enough liquidity on the network now to be highly functional. So people can reliably send payments with it. They're instantaneous. They're supported by the base layer itself. And so we're starting to see a bunch of apps now start to use it. Some exchanges starting to use it. And so I think this is an area that a lot of investors are kind of sleeping on, because it's been kind of this gradual foundation being laid over the past couple of years. And then only in the past 6 months are the actual use cases really starting to take off with actually commercial applications like Strike or Fold, as well as exchanges beginning to use it. So that's one thing to keep in mind for something like Bitcoin, is that it's that whole thing of software eating the world, right? It's basically we're laying a foundation, and you always have this decentralized network of different participants that are constantly working to make that a more potent network. We do face regulatory risks, right? So any new technology, any sort of paradigm shift is naturally going to be pushed back by legacy players that are affected by it. And one example I like to use is the period where gold was illegal. And so what this chart shows, the blue line is the 10-year yield that goes through 2020. And the orange line is the annualized inflation-adjusted forward return you would get if you bought the 10-year treasury that year and held it to maturity over the next decade. And so what you saw is that, the whole period from the 30s up to the 70s was generally a terrible time to buy treasuries. You just lost purchasing power. You got inflated away. And of course, that's the whole period. That's the 40-year period where gold was made illegal, right? So gold was the dollar was its peg versus gold ownership was made illegal, except for very tiny amounts for things like wedding rings and collectibles and things like that. And yet, of course, that was a time where owning gold would have been great because it went up 7x, and it of course massively outperformed the dollar. It outperformed what you could get by holding treasuries or bank accounts. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that most technologies, when they hit a critical mass, are very, very hard to stop. So electric vehicles had pushback from the prior industries. Electrification had pushback. Airplanes had pushback. Whenever you kind of push back against legacy systems with a new technology, you're naturally going to have a lot of pushback, and there will be challenges along the way. But that's how I'm framing it. I think that overall, I still like gold as an asset, but we are seeing the rise of a digitally native bear asset that I think is likely to continue to gain market share as it has over the past 12 to 13 years.